pretty much if you can see the battlefield, you're in a good spot. The battle is going to be moving across the field, so you'll have plenty of opportunities to see what's going on. And no matter where you are, you will see something interesting. Unless you're directly in front of me. Sorry. Now, to set the stage for the Battle of Stoney Creek and the lead up to it, 1813, when it opened up, didn't start out as a very positive year for either side. While the Americans had been blunted in 3 different attempts to invade Canada in 1812, not including Detroit, of course, the British forces were in a perilous situation. Canada could barely feed itself, let alone the troops that were being sent over, and the troops being sent over, well, few and far between. So the British were stuck in a situation where they didn't have a lot of ammunition, a lot of soldiers, or a lot of food. The Americans, on the other hand, had plentiful amounts of these, but their defeats in 1812 had soured many opinions in Washington and throughout the United States towards the war. The officers knew that if they were going to launch an invasion in 1813, they needed to improve the army that they had before them. And they did. Throughout 1814, training regimens were approved. Many of the officers that proved incompetent in 1812 were weeded out rather quickly. In fact, one was even sentenced to die, but it was commuted. He had friends in high places, don't you know? And so, with the new officers and with younger officers starting to take up leadership roles, the American Army launched its invasion at Fort George in Niagara-on-the-Lake at the end of May with an amphibious assault that is still studied to this day at West Point Military Academy as a perfect combined arms operation. Fort George fell, and the British troops retreated back up towards Burlington Heights. The Americans, thanks to poor leadership at the top, did not snatch up the British force when they had an opportunity, so they were able to retreat in relatively good order. But as they fell back, spirits were low, the men were getting tired, they were exhausted. Many of them had to abandon much of their baggage and personal things at Fort George to the enemy, and the Americans were now on a high. They were in high spirits, they were driving the British back, and they outnumbered them significantly. So we can see here a small group of British soldiers falling back and some refugees. There were many people living in Upper Canada who were either the descendants of or were loyalists during the American Revolution, and they already had a pretty strong opinion as to what potentially could happen to them if the Americans arrived. Now, today's slog from Niagara-on-the-Lake to Hamilton ain't that bad. I mean, you hop on the QEW and it's pretty easy. I mean, I can do it at least 10 minutes faster than my wife, but she obeys those weird numbers they put up next to the highway. And it's pretty easy. But back then, the roads were mostly mud. There were plenty of bridges everywhere. And cannons, like the one you see coming out into the field, they love getting stuck in that stuff. So as the British were withdrawing, they were facing these difficulties, but luckily for them, the Americans were facing them as well, and the American command situation began to bog down. Personalities and egos began to take over in the American forces. A younger general by the name of Winder, a brigadier general, he actually ended up convincing the commander, a very old man by the name of Dearborn. General Dearborn was actually nicknamed Granny Dearborn by his men. He couldn't even ride a horse, had to be carried around in a litter, and at night he insisted he have his hot water bottle. So not quite the soldiering spirit you wish you would have out in the forces anymore. But young Winder, who was a lawyer from Baltimore, age 37, convinced Dearborn to give him command of the chasing forces against the British. And while he was rather aggressive, he had no soldiering ability. One of his more glowing recommendations from a fellow officer was, General Winder speaks loud, makes a good impression, but carries emptiness under his hat. Winder was brave, but not terribly competent, and while his men tried to pursue, the British are seasoned veterans. The average British soldier that would be fighting at Stoney Creek had between 7 to 12 years experience. The average American, 10 months. So as the British are falling back, you can see they have their different regiments, they have their band with them. A lot of people find bands to be rather odd to bring out into the battlefield, but musicians were going to be excellent for communication out on the battlefield, as the human voice is drowned out by the sound of gunpowder and cannon. if you have drums or those high-pitched fifes, every parent here will tell you that high-pitched whining noise can be heard for a very long distance. So the fife is excellent for cutting through that noise and getting an order across the battlefield, communicating to your other troops, and ensuring that you can have control across the field. And especially during retreat, you want to make sure you know where everybody is, because at any moment you could be possibly ambushed. Now, it was during this retreat that the Americans revealed one of their deepest and darkest fears, and that was natives. The Iroquois Confederacy out in the Grand River, to a large portion, supported the British forces, and thanks to the fact that the American government had been putting out propaganda for about 50 or 60 years, the average American believed that the Mohawk Nation, or the Oneida, the Onondaga, any of those folks out there, were about 7 feet tall, 200 pounds of solid muscle, possibly 300. They had glowing eyes, breathed fire, they had sharpened teeth, and if they caught you, they'd rip your beating heart out of your chest with their bare hands, chew on it a bit, and just as you were about to pass out, they'd grab onto your hair and with a knife saw off your scalp so they could stick it up on the wall. That's not true at all. I mean, maybe one thing, maybe there was a tall guy, but no. For the most part, the Iroquois are human beings. We understand that. But you have to take into mind, these Americans never even seen a single native person their entire life. They've only heard stories, and the stories are hyped up. And when they're out on a battlefield a lot of times, they would hear a war cry rather than see a warrior. And suddenly the boogeyman becomes real. American troops were petrified of ambush from First Nation troops, as you can hear some war cries in the distance. And they had an excellent effect at whipping up the Americans into fear and frenzy, causing them to bundle up quickly, causing their officers to lose control. And it allowed the British plenty of time to withdraw. Now, the troops that you see taking the field now for the Crown Forces, these are the local boys. These are Canadian militia. Militia service in Canada was pretty simple. If you're an adult between 16 and 60, and you're male, you're in the militia. That's all there is to it. You come out, prove that you can operate the firearm, and your reward for coming out once a year for this was usually free beer and fireworks. So we have one of those things tonight. So being in the militia was, like I said, part of citizenship. A lot of these men took it rather seriously, and the government did try to uniform them. So while you do see some of the men are wearing a smattering of different outfits, they're wearing civilian clothes, there is a small group closest to you that's wearing green uniforms with blue trousers. They wanted to ensure that these men would be identified out on the battlefield because they understood that the enemy was fielding militia as well. The Americans relying heavily on militia during 1812 and 1813. And their militia typically showed up in civilian clothes too. And just like today, there isn't much of a fashion difference between a gentleman from New York and one from Ontario. So to help try to identify them from battle to battle, they would find small ways. For example, during the siege of Fort Erie, the New York State Militia had red hat bands and armbands, in hopes that they'd only get shot at by one side. As the troops are moving across the field, they're using light infantry tactics. Out on the open field, when you're skirmishing, you don't want to be in those big clumps like you normally see in the movies or in textbooks. You want to be spread out. This allows you to cover more ground, makes it harder for you to be hit, and sure, it makes it harder for you to hit the enemy. But the idea was that skirmishers were to harass. They were not meant to win battles. The Americans, though, had a slight advantage in this in some battles. If you notice in the American line, blue with red fringed coats down there, those are men representing soldiers of the Kentucky militia, and they are armed with rifled muskets. Pretty much every musket out on the field today is a smoothbore, which means at 100 yards it can miss its intended target up to 9 feet in any direction. No rifling means the musket ball just bumbles its way down. But the rifles have the rifling grooves that give the ball a spin as it comes out, sending it straight into the target, much like how quarterbacks throw footballs. And while this makes it significantly more accurate, with the longest confirmed kill during the war being 405 yards during the siege of Fort Meigs in Ohio, it does make them harder to load, and as a result, riflemen usually were supported by men with muskets, simply because they were faster and easier to load and could give them protection. And you do see some of the militia firing volleys down at the end. The volleys were used to counteract the problems of the musket, which was the pinnacle of military technology. Being smoothbore, as I mentioned, they're inaccurate. So the idea of having a group of men fire in one direction is somebody hits something. Even at 200 yards away, you can hit something that way. But it also counteracts the other problem, and that is they don't always work. As you're watching, every once in a while you're going to notice the muskets go click instead of bang. That's because the flintlock mechanism, anything can make it go wrong. You could have a gust of wind, a little bit of humidity, maybe the powder in your pan fell out. I could go on for quite some time about that, but suffice to say, about 20% of the time, they don't work. So by firing in a mass group, the hope is not only will you possibly hit something at 200 yards away, somebody had a working gun. And if you're in that mass group, while you're fixing the problem, there's lots of other soldiers that can keep firing. So this was the standard doctrine of the time, and it worked. But it did produce one final problem, which leads to the most popular question. Why on earth did the British walk onto an open battlefield in bright red with a white shoot me here X across their chest? And that is because they only want to get shot at by one side. You can see from the fighting here, just a couple muskets, how much smoke they can produce. Imagine at some of the larger battles how thick that smoke would get after a few volleys. The Battle of Lundy's Lane, you had close to 6,000 muskets out on the battlefield. It did not take long for the smoke to become so thick that the first you would see your enemy is about 20 paces away. So in that thick, smoky atmosphere, you didn't care about camouflage, you cared about making sure when your troops saw you, they didn't shoot. So the British, bright red. The Americans, bright blue. Red team, blue team, Leafs, Habs. If you thought you were smart and you showed up wearing camouflage, if you're wearing green or brown, anything like that, unfortunately, you're probably going to get shot at by both sides. And that was extremely common. During the Battle of Stoney Creek in the dark, it was noted that the American forces in confusion fired upon themselves several times. And at one point, a cavalry unit charged in the darkness, started slashing away, only to discover to their horror they had charged into friendly troops. Now, don't think the British weren't subject to this as well. At the Battle of Lundy's Lane, a Canadian regiment, the Glengarry Light Infantry, wearing a green uniform, lost more men to the British than to the Americans. If you don't know the man in front of you, shoot him. At least that way you get to survive. Now, we do have an excellent opportunity to point out some of the British officers that are out on the field. You can see a couple of them out in the center here with their nice scarlet coats, all the little bits of gold and finery dripping off of them. Now, officers were able to wear such nice uniforms because they paid for them. In the British military, you had to purchase everything, your uniform, weapons, equipment, and oftentimes even your rank. In 1812, the base rank of ensign, which is at the very bottom, cost you £400. Today, that's about $30,000 to $50,000. So it was a huge investment becoming an officer, but most officers in the British Army were about the third or fourth son in line. So dad's got money, but he's going to give it to your eldest brother. By the time he gets down to you, he doesn't really have much of an inheritance left. So he buys you into the army, ships you off, and says, make something of yourself. Army was pretty much the university of 200 years ago. Now, being an officer was extremely dangerous, but a good officer could do very well for themselves. For example, a Anglo-Irish son of a peer from Britain. He ended up in one battle winning £450,000 as a prize from booty captured on the battlefield. Translated into modern dollars, that's well into the millions. And that fellow would eventually become, well, at the time he was, the Duke of Wellington. So, not bad for starting off at the bottom there. You can do very well. Other side of the coin, you could end up dead. Being an officer, you were expected to expose yourself to danger, and casualty rates could be extremely high. At the Battle of Chippewa, one British regiment of its 18 officers, within 20 minutes of engaging the American forces, 16 were dead or wounded on the battlefield. And now we see the American forces coming out with their flags flying.
He's like, keep going.
Now, it should be noted, the American officer corps was extremely similar, but in other ways extremely different from the British. While these men typically came from the upper classes of society and did have to purchase most of their things, they did not purchase their rank. They were appointed. Being an officer in the U.S. Army usually meant you had friends in high places, or maybe a cousin who was a governor. In fact, that General Winder I mentioned earlier, well, his uncle was governor of Maryland, so that worked out well for him. Having political officers, though, has a serious problem. While in the British, having the aristocracy, they tend to at least train their men up. A lot of the officers in the American Army, due to their appointments, had no military experience. General Chandler, one of the other commanders of the American forces at Stoney Creek, his prior job was a blacksmith. But I will give credit to the American Army. By 1814, after defeat at Queenston Heights and Stoney Creek, a lot of these political appointees were removed or sent off to far-flung positions, and they were replaced with young, aggressive officers. A perfect way to show that is the average age of a general in the U.S. Army. In 1812, the average age of a general was 63 years old. In 1814, it was 33. So you have a definite shift, and the American Army, by 1814, was doing something not even the Imperial Guard of France could do. It was take on British soldiers in equal numbers and beat them. Feel free to give a little cheer if there's a great volley and you like it. And with these volleys, you're starting to see some of that smoke I mentioned earlier starting to build up on the field. You can imagine how quickly that can blind you out on the field.
It's rolling forward slowly.
I'll point out as well in the British forces, you'll notice there's some fellows carrying large spears. Those are pikes being carried by sergeants in the British forces. Sergeants carried those large pikes as a sign of their rank. They're also very handy, as you can hold them flat to hold men steady, push them forward. They're excellent hand-to-hand weapons, very good against a horseman. But these men, their primary job out in the field is making sure their men are keeping order, making sure if men are getting killed, that those spaces are being filled quickly. Basically just making it an easier job for the officers to make sure they got a well-oiled machine out on the battlefield. Sergeants were raised from the rank, and they typically had a lot of experience under the belt and were very capable men out on the battlefield.
Wow. That was good. Well, you just hit the one guy with the laser, right? Yeah.
Now for the sharper eyes, you will notice there is one more red coat I haven't spoken of yet, and he's in the American forces. There is a red coat in the American lines. He is not a prisoner, he is a musician. By tradition, musicians would wear reverse coloring. So the British bands here, they're wearing a green uniform with red cuffs and collars. The Americans, as a result, the musicians traditionally should wear a red coat with blue cuffs and collars. This could be problematic, you can understand, but it still is an interesting uniform and an interesting little impression across the field. Now in the American lines, you can see a variety of uniforms being worn. You can see some of the traditional blue, some of them with white taping, some of them without, and you see some wearing gray. When the Americans declared war on Britain, they declared war on their blue dye supplier, and as a result, blue dye prices skyrocketed. The Americans were found to have trouble getting a hold of sufficient supplies, and so many uniforms had to be pressed into service. There's record of men wearing white uniforms, brown, black, green, and the gray you see there was probably the most famous. These were work jackets the men would wear in substitute, so at least they would look uniform out on the field. And the gray jackets were very successful in the campaign of 1814. Enough so that if you visit West Point Military Academy, the official color of the uniform of the new professional army is not blue, it's gray. One of the reasons are those guys in gray 200 years ago, just over 200 years ago. Now, you good, loyal Canadians in the crowd, I am pleased to announce that we do have one 100% Canadian regiment taking field. They're on the American side. In 1813, after the fall of Fort George, there were a lot of people in Upper Canada, in that region, that did not care for how the British had treated them from the beginning of the war. They had been recent migrants, had been treated with suspicion, with judgment, and some of them had even had property taken from them by the British. And so they saw an opportunity to get revenge. Numbers of them joined up, and by mid of 1813, by July, there's about 150 of them that are fighting in the American forces, under the command of a man by the name of Joseph Wilcox. When Wilcox accepted his position in the United States military, he still held a seat in the legislature. And you think we got a problem now with Parliament. Now, Wilcox's Canadian Volunteers earn a particular black spot in Canadian history. They will be responsible for the burning of Niagara-on-the-Lake in the winter of 1813, as well as these men were branded as traitors. They had a pretty heavy weight over them, as they knew that if captured, they could potentially be sentenced for treason, which, according to the Ancaster Assizes in 1813, meant they would be hung, drawn, and quartered. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, I'm going to tell you, they hang you from the neck till half dead, bring you down, they cut you open, pull out your guts, burn them, and then just before you die, chop off your head. They then take your body, cut it up into 4 pieces, and send it to the 4 corners, stick your head on a spike, and tell everybody else, don't do what he did. Now, the Governor General, Prévost, noted that punishment had not been carried out for some time in Britain, and so as a result, the men who were sentenced to this, the only time in Canadian history it's happened, they actually just were hung and then beheaded. None of the other gruesome stuff. Still, though, some cold comfort for those gentlemen, I'm sure. Now, as the British were falling back towards Burlington Heights, tensions were getting a lot higher for these men. Constant engagements of the Americans showed just how much they were outnumbered. Estimates range in the British estimates from anywhere from 2 to 1 to 5 to 1, some of the officers were claiming. And their position at Burlington Heights was not that strong. Much of it had just been thrown together over the course of about a day or two, and most officers said unless they get about 5 times more troops, they're not going to be able to hold it against the American attack. This desperation made the British decide to do something which many of the officers declared to be reckless, and that was to launch a group of 900 men into an American camp in the dead of night for a surprise assault at their camp at Stoney Creek. We know how it went from there, but I'm still trying to build up suspense.
Wow. Oh.
Now, the American forces did come very close to just continuing on and charging right up into the Burlington Heights. They got within sight of the British defenses when they were ordered to withdraw. Winder was all in favor of continuing his push, but General Chandler caught up with his troops, and being the senior general, he gave orders that they should withdraw and camp, as he felt the men were too exhausted to push on a full assault. That, and he wanted to reconnoiter the enemy position. His plan for the next day was he was going to march his men around the British position and attack their flank, pinning them up against the lake, and then hopefully crushing their forces. Now, at the end of a battle, one of the biggest problems on the field is there are many men who are wounded. The casualty rates at the time were not as horrific as you might think. Wounding was much higher than dead in many instances, and these wounds needed to be treated quickly. Without the medical equipment that we have today, these men could linger sometimes for a couple days out on a battlefield and unfortunately pass. But we do remember that this is a battlefield. The men who fought and died here, be they American, British, Canadian, or First Nations, it doesn't matter why they did it, but we should remember them, because if you're willing to fight and die for something, maybe someone should think of you sometimes. So in honor of the men who served here, and as a token, the smallest thing we can do is offer them a moment of silence and a lament. So ladies and gentlemen, if you please remove your caps if you got them, and we'll have a lament.
Arr!